Um, welcome everyone to our latest prep seminar, Peacebuilding in Our City times Environment. Just to let everyone know, if you're joining us online, we're recording the event, so anyone who misses it can do it later on PrEP's website, which is nyupeace.education. I want to note that this is the second seminar and the third event in PrEP's year-long exploration of domestic peace building, following our reflections from the field event in September and a seminar earlier this month with members of the Red Hook Initiative's public safety team. And that we're going to resume the series, the seminar series in the spring semester with seminars in February, March, and April, and we'll have announcements about the next seminar probably in late January. Thank you, Vijayta, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here, have you back here in Woolworth. I would say for the last time, but I know you already told me you're coming tomorrow, so
I'm definitely going to try my best.
It'll be the next to last time you're joining us here in Woolworth. For those of you who don't know Vijayta, or for those of you who do, she leads the Climate Fund and Urban Innovation Ecosystem Development in her role as Program Director at New York at CivLab. Her focus is implementing models for stakeholder collaboration for the New York urban tech community in an inclusive manner. Her diverse professional background started with filmmaking and film producing in New York and India. She has worked with organizations such as UN Women, PrEP here at NYU, and has worked in Nairobi and Kenya on peace building, humanitarian and development work. She holds an M.Sc in global affairs and a B.S. in film and television from Boston University. So thank you, Vijayta, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. So, Tom said a lot to introduce me, but I guess, for those of you who are meeting for the first time, I graduated in 2020 and I focused on international development, peace building, and the data specialization as well. I'm going to start by sort of introducing CivLab, but I think my intention for this conversation is to take you through our work and kind of build in the peace building connects through that process. Cool. So, how do I go?
You need to click on that.
To click? Okay. Oh, fantastic. Okay. So CivLab is an innovative grant-making network that channels global funds and resources directly to community climate initiatives. Now, this is a new mission statement. We just got here. And it's been quite a road in the last, 2.5 years that I've worked there. We did not start out this way. So I think I kind of want to trace the journey to how we got here as well. So both of you, to start off with, are you both in peace building?
I am.
You are.
Yeah.
But
it's my first semester.
Okay, cool. But you, cool. Sorry. Cool. Okay. Because I'm going to be touching upon a few peace building concepts through the presentation. So I just kind of wanted to gauge the familiarity. So when I was here, Tom heard me break my head over the course of the 2 years on, and I was at the workshop panel of the reflections from the field. And I know that you guys touched a lot, or you ladies touched a lot upon the feeling of, do we deserve to do this work? Are we the right people to do this work? And the dilemma that comes with being people from a privileged society, often global north, going to this global south place and telling people how to live their lives, essentially. And there's a lot of internal conflict that comes with that. And I definitely had it as well, because I'm from India, which is not necessarily what we call global north. I don't know what the appropriate term is even anymore for these things, but I come from a very privileged socioeconomic background. So I definitely, and my time in the workshop sort of kind of solidified the fact that I don't think I want to be going to any place that is not where I'm from, or not a context that I inherently understand and feel like I'm entitled to be in to do work of this nature. So I was trying to figure out over the course of 2 years how I could take what we learned here and apply it in contexts that I understand a little better, that I feel like I have the right to work in, or even in a position where, I, as an outsider, can pass something on in a way that is not prescriptive and more, but more maybe empowering in a, respectful and healthy manner. And during that time, I did take a class, entrepreneurship in the globalized world, taught by one Simon Sylvester Chaudhary, who is the founder and CEO, I learned, of a nonprofit called CivLab. And we got to talking because I discovered that CivLab, like the mandate of CivLab, very tiny nonprofit. Our core mandate is to act as bridge builders in the urban tech and innovation space in New York City at the time. And I was very fascinated by that because, the core premise of the work is that people working on smart and sustainable city initiatives work in deeply siloed manners. And the job of CivLab and Simon was to figure out how to build connective tissue between all of these different entities. So I'm going to get into that and start there. So the platform that existed to create these connections was called the Grid. Still active, but not as active as we used to be. But at the time, the Grid was sort of CivLab's pilot initiative, and we built connective tissue between the diverse stakeholders that make urban tech happen. Now, what is urban tech? Very quickly, it's anyone who is utilizing or created and utilizing a tech-based solution to contribute towards smarter and more sustainable city work. This could be in mobility, accessibility, smart buildings, ag tech, so smart agriculture. What else? I guess sensors and AI. So all around you, like, cities are powered by technology, but some of that technology exists to optimize and make a city a greener and more sustainable place. And so we were kind of working within that realm. And we had identified several reasons that, much like peace building, you say, if all of these peace building initiatives are happening, why isn't there more peace in the world? It's like, if all of these, different smart and sustainable city initiatives are happening, why is our city broken? Why does the subway suck? Why, why is there flooding? Why is everything kind of crumbling? And, much like peace building, there were sectoral silos, people across the industry. So public sector, private sector, government, investors, startups, nonprofits, communities themselves, everyone's working towards the same goal, but no one's talking. On the government side, and, in general, the funding side, RFPs and funding cycles are arduous, long, and it's hard to, kind of know exactly what is available to you in terms of resources and funding opportunities, and also in terms of, if you're technology that wants to work in the city of New York, you have to apply for a grant with the city and work with the city, and that is a nightmare. And it also shifts with the political landscape in the city as well. As we know, our new governor has very specific things he wants to work on, and some programs are therefore slashed as a result. And also misaligned incentives, different stakeholders. So sectoral groups have different priorities and don't understand what everyone else is working towards. It is quite amazing how people live in a bubble. And as a result, you have this mishmash of people talking and a lot of noise, but no coherence. And, what we aim to do through something like the Grid was building value across sectors and stakeholders through, figuring out platforms and ways in which to get them to interact, coordinate resources and agendas, and understand each other better, and hopefully lead to actual projects. So, I can share this deck later, but this kind of illustrates what value means to the main different stakeholder groups we identified at the time. And now from peace building lens. Now this is, 2019, Vijayta was like, oh my God, web theory, I instantly was just like, but this is web theory. Like what this work is trying to achieve is what, web theory tries to illustrate as well. And yes, we can all agree to disagree on letter arc, but there was something here. There was something here in terms of understanding the social geography, finding the location of intersections, and being smart flexible, which is the ability to adapt to, respond to, and take advantage of emerging and context-based challenges. And that's exactly what we were doing. And so I want you to kind of remember this, as well as the yeast theory that he has, kind of going forward, which is basically thinking of who rather than how many it takes to, make things grow exponentially beyond their numbers. So who, though not like-minded or like-situated in any given context, would have a capacity, if they were mixed and held together, to make things grow exponentially. And I think that's what we were trying to achieve, really. So I ended up doing a capstone, sort of trying to mesh these concepts very unsuccessfully. I'm not proud of it, and I'm not going to share it with anyone. So don't ask me for it. But I definitely was trying to think about how these two things could mesh together back then. And so a little bit about what we did as the grid. There was a lot of informal connection building, a lot of personal introductions, and acting as a conduit between different grid members who encompassed, there were over 120 of them from different sectors across New York City working on urban tech solutions, and connecting them, they come to us being like, we want funding for this, or we want to, we're doing a project on data, we'd like to collaborate with an academic institution. And, we made a lot of different connections happen. But there were also formalized ways through which we did this work too. And I think one of our main and most successful offerings were civic studios, which is essentially bringing strategically curated groups of people around a table to discuss a specific decided upon issue. Someone would come to us with a problem they wanted to solve, or around their city. And beyond a forum for just talking, it was everyone who comes into this room is coming into this room with the goal of coming out of it with something actionable that they can work on beyond it. And so we even incubated a startup centered around smart building solutions as a result of one of our civic studios. So, when you think about who it takes to start a movement or start change, this is kind of what we were doing, but it wasn't named Peacebuilding. So it was fascinating to me. And I even got my boss, Simon, to read The Moral Imagination. And Tom calls me Trojan Horse of Peacebuilding in that respect. And he definitely, as he was reading it, was messaging me being like, oh my God, web. Oh my God, yeast. And I think, yes, Simon. So you see why I wanted to work here. He's like, we do this. And yes, we did do this. But there were a lot of key takeaways that I personally had over the course of that time. Something I now realize is that, we were doing work that really adopted peace building theories, but I wasn't sure whether it was peace building work in the context of the city, but something I realized over the course of working, the first year and a half of working with CivLab was, yes, we were creating a lot of connection between people in the urban tech and innovation space who were industry people, who were working on solutions. But there was one gaping, disconnect. We didn't have any people who could actually speak to the needs of the end users of this technology, of any of these technologies, and that is citizens and bodies that represent the interests and realities and needs of New Yorkers. And that was something I definitely, spotted early on. So how can you develop solutions for cities without talking to end users? How can you do that? But then how do you actually involve them in these conversations? It's not as easy as you would think. And citizens are very jaded with people like us because they have been let down many times with people who say, we represent your best interests, and then sort of disappear or just can't deliver. And something I noticed is that there are a lot of structures and institutions that are supposed to serve New Yorkers that don't have any cohesion and can't actually efficiently deliver services to them. In spite of acknowledging the importance of collaboration, which a lot of people we talked to and sort of explored collaborations with acknowledge, it's such an intangible thing. We're in the business of collaboration. It's something that people take for granted, but it's very hard to get people to act on it then. people have their own agendas, their own realities at their workplaces and their jobs. So why should they go out of their way to, work with someone like this one academic institution or this nonprofit? Their processes are different, their mandates are different. If we're trying to engineer a connection between, private sector entity and a nonprofit, the nonprofit might not have the capacity to work with the private sector company because they're focused on their own work. So we're asking people to step out of their comfort zones a little bit to work on shared goals, but it's easier said than done. And that was a very big learning, is that ultimately it's hard to de-silo any ecosystem. It's very, very hard. So I think the main takeaway from this kind of first chapter was that peacebuilding theory can bring value to roles you wouldn't expect, and it can exist. It can be applicable to roles that you wouldn't expect, in places you wouldn't expect. And that don't seem outwardly peacebuilding oriented. But to my previous point of how do you get people to work together? Turns out a crisis such as COVID is a great way to get people to work together. So it was very interesting in the summer and spring of 2020 to be already at the center of a lot of this big network, because when you are a watcher and people know that you are connected to so many other people, that you have so many threads going outwards, when they have supply or demand for something, they come to you and they ask you like, hey, I have this PPE and I don't know where it should go to have immediate impact, for example. So we were getting a lot of ad hoc requests in March and April of 2020 for people who suddenly had a lot of resources or who had requests and who were suddenly, changing their mandates to get involved in, COVID response stuff. And so they were coming to us with all of these requests that were very collaboration and connection-oriented. And so we very quickly set up this temporary thing called the NYC Response Lab with Cornell Tech and the New York Economic Development Corporation, who funded the grid as well. And so it was a hub for, collaboration to create and deploy solutions in response to COVID-19. And I want to take you through one example of when this really, worked, and something that I think represents the tremendous capacity for this work and peacebuilding as an intersection. But I also first want to touch upon the fact that this particular instance very much impressed upon me that, and not just COVID, but all of the other events of 2020 and summer 2020 especially impressed upon a lot of us that structural violence exists in New York City and in many other cities in the USA. And I think it's fundamentally a fallacy for, global North countries to claim that there is no need for peace building in their own backyards, because, structural violence exists, and it represents, and I'm going to read this out, the systematic ways in which some groups are hindered from equal access to opportunities, goods, and services that enable the fulfillment of basic human needs. So this can be formal, as in legal structures that enforce marginalization, or they could be culturally functional but without legal mandate, such as limited access to education or healthcare for marginalized groups. We saw, I think, a manifestation of both of these forms of structural violence in 2020. Not to say that it already didn't exist, but everything came to a boiling point for sure. You had overt, limitations on access to adequate healthcare services. You had overt marginalization, or the proof that certain groups in the city, aka marginalized Black communities, were discriminated against, and not just in terms of the provision of goods and services, but from a security point of view as well. So kind of keeping so that was definitely a big realization, and it wasn't really an aha moment at the time, but it definitely, kind of reinforces the case for, okay, how do we think about the work that we're doing here and its potential for peace building? And so, so something that I consider a very big success, and also an example of being smart, flexible. Nice, was the Red Hook project. And you'll recognize the Red Hook Initiative's logo on there, actually. So I forget who came to us to start with. I think maybe all three, we were in conversation with Cornell Tech and the Red Hook Initiative. So Red Hook, as we know, is home to one of the largest NYCHA low-income housing community in New York City, and a big aging population as well. And there was right off the bat an issue in terms of ensuring that people there had access to healthcare services, and also like COVID-19 checkup services. Like, are people okay? Are they getting the help they need? So essentially what happened here is we collaborated with the Red Hook Initiative, who are grounded in that community, and also invited us in to work there. Because I think the main thing that we have learned through our work is you can never presume to go in anyway. You have to be invited in. And if you want to do work at the grassroots, someone has to invite you there and also has to trust you. And they're not just going to give you access just because you say you can do this cool, helpful thing. So we were working with the Red Hook Initiative, for access to households in the community. We also worked with Cornell Tech, who are on Roosevelt Island, and we, had the access to professors and students who designed a survey that could kind of quickly check symptoms and, be tabulated through data analysis mechanisms. And we then utilized the phone banks of former council member Carlos Menchaca to actually conduct the outreach using the survey. And then the data was fed back to Cornell Tech, who analyzed it and then connected to, healthcare services through that. And we didn't do any of this work, we facilitated the connections, but we were able to, through our connections, sort of spot who could be of most help in this situation. So I think that was a very big learning experience in terms of, during times of crisis, people's barriers to entry are very low. People are very willing to collaborate. And also the value of being connected in a city like this and knowing who has what to offer at any point in time, and also understanding the strength of different kinds of stakeholders and what resources they might have to offer and where it might be available. So this kind of taught me that there's a need for peace building in contexts that you don't actually expect, and this work can intersect with peace building. So now that brings us to present day. We very much are in the business of bridge building still, but something that we have shifted our focus to because of demand and urgency is the climate crisis. We had an opportunity to sort of receive funding from a private sector entity and re-grant it as an intermediary funder to climate projects in New York City, because being at the center of a network, we sort of are privy to what's going on at the ground, at the grassroots level and at the middle, but also are in conversation with people who, historically are at positions of power and have access to funding and, decision-making as well. And so a little bit of background, shockingly little money has gone towards climate change. This is all real data. And so it was very obvious that there is a need for more money that is going very, very specifically towards climate initiatives. And what's holding climate innovation back? Surprise, surprise, it's very similar to the reasons that the grid was formed in New York. And I'm going to speak for New York City and cities in general. And the reason that we kind of decided to make this segue is because our mandate was urban tech and innovation and also urban economic development by virtue of that. And a lot of that work already intersects with climate in several ways, because a lot of companies and entities we work with, their mandate is to make cities smarter and more sustainable places. So it was definitely an easier shift for us to make in terms of focusing on climate. And so, we did our research, and we kind of realized that we need to actually, you know what, this isn't even a research thing. This is very obvious that climate change needs to be tackled in an inclusive, coordinated manner. And we have to listen to the people and communities who are at the forefront of experiencing the impacts of climate change. There are a lot of those in New York City. And so, these are some guiding questions that sort of, as we conceptualize this fund and beyond, that we are trying to answer still. So to tell you a little bit about the fund, we decided to call it Climate Fund 1. There are two pillars to it. The first one is the intermediary fund itself. It's corporate and philanthropic giving, and set up in cities specifically. So each fund is place-based. And we want to support community climate initiatives and ideally people and entities who, find it hard to receive grant funding or, are maybe passed over. And we want to do so through the formation of an advisory committee made up of people and stakeholders who have more of a right and knowledge to decide where the funding goes than we do. I know nothing about climate change from a technical perspective. So if I were to get a proposal, I probably am not the right person to say where it goes. So we're building right now an advisory committee that's going to decide, with using, amongst all of the proposals we get, where the funding for this first round should go. But beyond that, what we do well is ecosystem building and creation. We want to create as much as possible a de-siloed ecosystem of climate actors in New York City and all the cities we expand to afterwards. So the collab piece, which is the ecosystem, we're still figuring out what that looks like. But we have launched the fund. The application is live. We're getting applications in. There's a lot of interest. And we have 1 million to start out with, and we're going to be giving it out in grants over the next 18 months to New York and also now Michigan. Organizations working in, and we have 3 funding pillars: climate education, climate workforce development, and technology. So we've kind of broadened our mandate to include education and workforce development as well, because we kind of see it as 3 things working in tandem. You need awareness fundamentally of climate change and the way it intersects with your life. We need to train people to be able to do jobs of the present, yesterday, and the future that that work towards a more climate friendly world. And there's a lot of tech being developed to make our cities a little greener. So we're trying to, we want to fund under those 3 buckets. And there are intersections with some of our applicants who are doing, 2 or 3 of these, this pertinent work. And we also want to figure out how, without, potential future grantees and the other people who are already in our ecosystem, how we can actually generate conversation and action beyond just grants. So I don't know if I'm going to do this activity, but I will say that as we think about our advisory committee and the ecosystem piece, something that I want to take forward more proactively is the knowledge that beyond just giving money where it should go to people who are doing important grassroots level work, what is our role as an entity that sort of exists in the middle and has connections that are grassroots up, but also top down? What is our role in how we create these different groups of people? How are we cognizant of how we're shifting power? How are we cognizant of who is involved in each of these different entities? So the advisory committee and then the broader ecosystem, and what role do they have to play? And I think there is a tremendous role for peacebuilding thought to be folded into this. And I don't think I would have been able to get to here if I hadn't experienced the trajectory of, starting where we started with the grid and then seeing us through COVID. we have all of these different stakeholders who need to form like a 7 to 9 person body. And that's something that we're thinking very seriously about who should be part of it and, what knowledge and perspectives do they bring? And, who has the authority to determine where funding goes? Do we want people who traditionally already have a seat at the table to be a part of this? Do we want people who represent community voices to be a part of this? Do we want people who, work for, more like institutionally powerful entities to be a part of this, but who actually are on the ground working? So who needs to form this committee? These are all questions we have, and this is the advisory committee's mandate. But the thing is, given the right combination, and also if we do the ecosystem building bit right, this, has the potential to lead to a more equitable distribution of resources. These grants are unrestricted funding. And because the mandate is so broad, it's technology, workforce development, and education. We have everyone from community-based organizations to startups applying. Like, we have a huge pool of people. Like, it's, we're kind of like getting people to interact who don't traditionally interact by virtue of the fact that this fund is so open. People are quite confused by it, actually. We hopefully could include people in our work who have not, historically been included. And we hopefully could lead to more inclusive climate action, because also we're trying to build more trust to the way we think about our relationship with our grantees through minimal reporting requirements and, more of what do you need from us? And we don't presume to know what you need from us. And we also are very cognizant of the fact that grantor-grantee relationships inherently are there's a power dynamic and we don't want to abuse it. Now, going forward, and I also have an opportunity to do some research with PrEP or under PrEP. And I think this is something that I'm going to focus on, is how do we more formally hold peace building theory and concepts into how we conceptualize bodies like this. Because reframing such relationships in context as peace building is important, as it allows you to think of your work from the capacity it has for structural change. And, I think what peace building has given me is this awareness of, the capacity this work has for structural change. It's very easy to just kind of get sucked into your work and be like, we need to make sure these grants are dispersed. We need to make sure that, we give grantees what they want. But then when you think about all of this work in the grander capacity of how do we make an ecosystem of climate actors converse with each other and create change that is more impactful, and that by virtue of, hopeful success will also address some, not all, but some, symptoms of structural violence. So if I were to go in with that, framing it through that lens, I wonder what I'm going to find. I don't have any answers, but it's definitely something I'm thinking about right now. And something else, as I kind of, we come to the end of this presentation, is as everyone thinks about how peace building work happens outside, and maybe not necessarily in the traditional field or what we think of it as, it's not often named as peace building, but it doesn't mean it's not. It might not look like what you expect. And one thing I choose to believe about our work is that it is strategic peace building, because it connects people and groups on the ground with policymakers and power brokers. It aims not only to resolve conflicts, but to build societies, institutions, policies, and relationships that are better able to sustain peace and justice. I don't see why this work this thinking cannot apply to work that happens in our cities. So work that unwittingly utilizes peace building blocks or peace building building blocks happens everywhere. However, the value we can bring to it as people who know and study peace building is in seeing it for what it is, naming it, Trojan horses, and figuring out how we can more proactively apply this knowledge to yield more positive, sustainable outcomes in our work. So it's
There's a lot there. Thank you for getting through all of that. Well, I have a million things that I could ask, but Let's go to everyone on online or anyone in the room. Any questions or responses to Vijayta?
I have a question. So I guess like you were talking a little bit about like during the pandemic and sort of seeing like firsthand the structural violence that exists in like New York City during the pandemic. And I'm wondering if that's like something that you discussed like at Civ Lab, and if it's something you're like working to address, or is that still kind of just something that you've seen because of your peace building background?
I think it's something I wouldn't have been able to think of it in those terms if it wasn't for peace building. But again, while we don't discuss it in those terms, what does often happen is, we discuss it in terms of, concepts that are more familiar to people who work in cities, such as accessibility to resources and, marginalization of communities and, the digital divide, for example, the access to internet, the access to broadband, how, the lack thereof affects people's livelihoods and affects and like fundamentally disables people in terms of participating in the economy as it exists today. So the phrase structural violence is not used, it is not thought of as that, but it doesn't mean it's not talked about in very broad terms. But you really have to read between the lines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you use the term like peace building with anyone aside from your?
No, I use it. So we're a very small team, and they all know that it's something I'm very interested in. And I don't think that I think I'm lucky enough that everyone would be really receptive to it. If I were to try to implement something.
Yeah.
But it's not something that I utilize in an everyday manner.
Yeah.
And I think that this would be something that I would have to very intentionally figure out how to build into ways we, for example, assess who or think about who needs to be on this advisory council, or ways we think about bringing people together. So it's all in strategy. I think there's tremendous potential for it to be folded into the more strategic aspects of our work.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be called peace building. I can tell you that, but it doesn't mean it's not going to be peace building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think somebody's got a question.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Vijayta. That was really, really great. So informative and thought-provoking. I learned a lot, so thank you. Question. In your work and kind of as you are kind of putting together this initiative, have you come across any cities here in the United States or abroad that model what you're looking for? Are there any best practices, any kind of best initiatives, so to speak, that that you found were interesting?
Honestly, no. I will say that we learned a lot as we were doing research. Vienna, cool. I will look at Vienna. We were doing a lot. We did a lot of research when we were setting up the fund, and I think we learned a lot from the participatory grant making community as a whole. Because I think the fundamental mandate of participatory grant making is that money and funding comes with inherent power dynamics, and how do we diffuse those power dynamics to make decisions on who gets money and the way money flows a little more inclusive, and decided by the people who would make use of that funding. So I think in general, I'm inspired by the participatory grant making community just tremendously. And I think that in general, people are trying to figure out how to better incorporate participation of citizens and communities in money and in the language of money as it flows through in development and peace building spheres, which I think is really encouraging.
Agree completely. Thank you, Vijayta.
So staying on the money train, I was interested to see your slide mentioning how little philanthropic money is going to climate change. I think that would surprise a lot of people. And part of the reason this surprised me is because I've been going through life these last 10 years or so with the understanding that the field that is actually most underfunded is peace building. So I would like to see the numbers. I don't have them with me right now, but I know that there's actually the Peace and Security Funders Group that tracks this every year. And it's funny, we actually have a speaker in my class tomorrow night who works with us, Reva.
I need to go to the class tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So she's going to be talking about this, and this is one of the issues, is that of course, peace building is suffering from exactly the same, at least, result. I don't know if the phenomenon is the same. And it does make me wonder, you know, there's very few people in, let's say, in the public sphere who don't acknowledge that, you know, violence is a huge problem. And there's very few people in the public sphere who don't acknowledge that climate change is a huge problem. And yet both of them are not getting the funding they deserve, which is, you know, causing other problems. Is that a coincidence, or is there, I mean, in your estimation, you think about that now that you've been thinking about the similarities between doing this work, why would these two sort of complicated, you know, really important problems not be getting sufficient funding? Like not even sufficient funding, like way below what is sufficient funding.
Oh, that's a tough question, Tom. Yeah, you know, it's really interesting. I think, and something that I would be curious to see is in the you know, the types of things that do get funding. How much of this work is built into those things, and how different is it from this work? It's something I've noticed about both peace building and climate change is that there are aspects of a lot of different things that tackle, you know, the problems that both, you know, I guess people who work in the field try to solve, but maybe not in a very direct manner. So I would be curious to see how much funding indirectly goes towards these things. Not to say that direct funding shouldn't go to these things, it should. But one thing I have learned is that the things like these two fields like have many different names, and they exist in many different shapes and forms. Like peace building exists in the world I work in, but it doesn't go by that name. You know, and I'm sure you like heard from the Red Hook Initiative, you know, that's something that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So I would be curious to see how much of it is going towards this stuff, but maybe not in name. But I think the other thing I would say is that, hey, big money always has another sexy thing of the moment that it wants to give to. So hopefully climate change is sexy now. Who knows? Maybe it'll get money.
I wonder if the complexity, I mean, this is a longer conversation.
Yeah.
Like the complexity of these two fields, whether it's working against them in some ways, whereas human rights work gets 10, 20 times as much funding as peace building, because that's much clearer to people what that is.
Yeah,
There's a list of things you can do and can't do.
that's true. That's very true.
Yeah.
I mean, listen, SIVLab, like collaboration, I just kind of throw that in there. Like I said, we are in the business of ecosystem harmonization.
Nobody wants to pay for that.
Exactly.
Right.
Everyone takes it for granted. Everyone's like,
Yeah.
yes, everyone takes it for granted, but it doesn't grant. No one wants to pay for it. You know, so these are things that I guess people are like, oh yeah, duh, it's important. But no one wants to pony up the cash. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Something else for you to work on.
Yes. Oh, yes, we'll work on it.
Go ahead.
No, I'm curious, so like in thinking about system harmonization and in general, there's this really positive spirit of collaboration that you're trying to kind of cultivate. And thinking about these different power dynamics. I don't know if this is what you mean, but I would think like normally someone hears that like, okay, government entities have more power than other entities. I'm wondering if than a grassroots entity, I'm wondering if you've seen now that these applications are trickling in, like if you're noticing any tensions among even the grassroots actors, and there's an example that made me think about this, and I'm asking this because I think there's also an interesting opportunity there, but so for example, you know, there was a really big conflict generated around the East River Park and the flood mitigation. And on the one hand, you have this activist group that called themselves environmental activists that were really fighting the, you know, eco-genocide of trees. And on the other side, you had NYCHA residents who were fighting to knock down the park and rebuild the walls because, you know, during Sandy, they were really, you know, impacted by the flooding. And there are these like two communities that both, you know, could be seen as climate change activists that were kind of just really in deep conflict with one another. And I'm wondering if like either in the applications that you've been seeing or in your survey of the landscape, if you're noticing some of these points of tension among people who are working towards mitigating climate change, and if that maybe can be an opportunity that.
Not yet. The applications have just kind of started to come in. So I would actually like, thank you for pointing that out, because that will be something that, you know, to keep an eye out for. Our work has not to this point intersected too much with activist groups.
Yeah.
But we do, one thing we did, obviously, you know, find out like consistently is that it is important to have climate justice representation in whatever we do. I would be interested to see what that actually ends up looking like.
Yeah, because like bringing those
that's a good
people together at the table is
Yeah.
probably part of this harmonization.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right, and I'm very interested to see what, like, again, that is something to consider as we go forward in terms of what kind of community we want to build as well. Yeah.
Oh, is there somebody else in the chat? I see.
Those were Sylvia's.
There's somebody's comments. Okay, I just want to make sure there's no other questions. Well, we're almost out of time here. And Vijayta, thank you for coming. I hope you'll come back again, and then we'll find a way to get a bunch of students in the room, like actually with us, because I think, you know, I think this is one of these things that, again, we're sort of shooting over people's heads where the conversation is a little bit too complicated for people to be, you know, not that they can't understand it, of course they can, but it's hard for people to grasp what it is we're actually talking about here. But it's really important to think about from a peace building perspective, yes, but also from a climate change perspective, you know, because you're fundamentally saying it's about really reframing the work in a way so that it can become much more impactful and involve many more stakeholders in a much more, I think, respectful and, you know, participatory way. And that's actually what, you know, I know that you're aiming for.
Yeah, it's something I kind of want to bring up, which has been really interesting as we have been setting up this fund. I tend to find myself thinking from a very bottom-up lens. I and a coworker of mine are very like, oh, we need to make sure that there is community representation on, you know, on the advisory committee. We need to make sure that all like people who like typically don't have a seat at the table have it. And my boss, who, you know, comes from a very different point of view, he's an entrepreneur. He also has to, you know, he's the person who does the fundraising and, you know, kind of brings in the big players. And also like, so we sometimes have tension where he's just like, no, but these people have to be here. And we're like, no, but these people have to be here. Something that he did remind me of though, he really took to the whole concept of being middle out. He really took to it. But he did say, you know, working in this capacity, you have to think about everyone and not just, you know, the people like bottom up, like grassroots level up. And while I disagree with him on many things in general, and we work things out often enough. I do see the point of like, okay, there has to be a role for private sector, city government. It might not be on the advisory committee, but where can it be then? Because they do have resources and things to offer, but we need to think about that too. If we want to bring everyone together, that means everyone. So that's kind of been something that I've been chewing over a little bit.
I guess I just have a question of whether, I mean, we've seen this in Peacebuilding a little, but and to take it more seriously when it comes to security. And I'm just wondering if when you're talking to your investors or trying to fundraise, whether you see a difference or you try to talk more in the language of climate security of danger rather than climate justice, whether it makes a difference. And I'm just saying this because I keep having the number of the budget of the New York Police since the last seminar that we had. That always comes to my mind, and I compare this number to every other number. Like, and even like here in the slide, it was the first thing that came to my mind. So I'm just wondering if this brings somehow more money.
Well, in my case, I couldn't really answer that question because the people we speak to, I mean, everyone is realizing right now that climate change is a problem. So we, like, our language is very, much more climate action, climate initiatives. We do have climate justice in there. So we've never used the word climate security or, that, because we haven't, I don't think we've like even thought about using that language either. Yeah. Which is pretty nice. Yeah, that's we don't have to do that. I didn't even think about that actually.
But maybe you have to, if you want like the NYPD to be involved or to sit at the table because they have resources and are going to be, on the front line or whatever.
Unfortunately, yeah. Maybe, yeah. That's a good point. Yeah.
One more question, if I can. You also mentioned that was how the pandemic actually was like the kind of like it lowered the barriers for entry for people to collaborate with each other. And I'm wondering if that has kind of like continued or if people have sort of gone back in their silos since like we're all kind of like back to normal at this point-ish.
I think that's more openness. But we are very like impressive in our ability to, act like nothing happened.
Yeah.
So yes. I wouldn't say everything's changed. We aren't getting eager, requests for the walls are back up. But we did build trust with a lot of people who might be a little more amenable to considering things, requests for collaboration in the future.
Yeah.
We've now seen that it's very easy to do clearly, if you really want to. People you really want to, and that's also a problem, and that's one thing I was thinking about is. And everyone, please correct me if I'm just saying something very wrong here, but even in peace building, there is a need that in the field brings people together very intentionally. People know why they're there. And
I don't know how that's think about that.
You're thinking about these settings of like it's direct violence.
Exactly.
Yeah, like a war.
Exactly. So in those kinds of things, if people, there might, there are people who've been brought together for that purpose, but I guess if you're working in the day-to-day where nothing is seemingly wrong, why should people collaborate? Why should they work together? They can say that they can acknowledge that it's important, but there's no reason to actually go out of their way or go out of their comfort zone and divert resources and time to working together. So it's an upward battle. It definitely is.
All right, well, much more conversation, thought, research, writing needs to be done here. And
Yes.
you will lead us in this direction.
Really?
Yes, you will lead us in this direction because no one's ever come into this room. I will say this in my 15 years here and made more references to Letterrock and the Moral Imagination than you just did in the last hour. So,
Including
good
me
job.
in the
Yeah.
years that we've worked together.
No, never.
It's just Yeah, that was like the first thing I saw when I like encountered CivLab. But I also made a reference to Gautam. So. That's just sitting down on my notes, didn't come up, but wanted to draw some parallels.
See, she did her reading.
Yes. I feel like that's really cool to like. Yeah, I mean, I don't think about these things on a daily basis, maybe I should more. And yeah, now I want to like go back and like reread the Moral Imagination over like winter break.
It's fun.
I actually bought a new copy after one of our conversations. And I was like, I'm gonna go back and reread it.
Basically, he doesn't tell you what to do. He's just like, the school thing in nature.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I think about it. Like, you're not wrong. And I'm sure this is not the only way to do things, but I definitely see some merit in like thinking through this lens, like biomimicry,
Absolutely. Well, I hope that you let's keep talking. And,
Yes.
So
have to figure out my research.
through your affiliation with Prep, we'll keep this conversation going.
Absolutely.
So thanks everyone who's here, and
Thank you for having me.
thank you for
You.